like the yeah. Can I check? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so today I'm just going to be briefly but comprehensively as much as I can just running through substantive arguments in the BP format specifically, but I think most of it should be cross applicable to AP. So I'm going to go through a few things, and it's sort of chronologically arranged. So the first thing I'm going to go through is just brainstorming. So brainstorming is essentially when you receive a motion, how do you turn that motion into substantive arguments? Like how should you approach a motion to find and dig out those arguments? Then I'll be going through construction. So what are some ways that you can organize a substantive argument and make sure that your argument is sort of completed? Thirdly, I'll be going through strategy. So just knowing roughly strategy, which substantive arguments are best to run. And I think strategy tends to be particularly important in the BP format because you have to strategize against not just your opposite bench, but also your closing harms. And lastly, I'm just going to do a quick note on rebuttals and extensions, which I'll briefly explain how you can apply a lot of the ideas in substantive construction to rebuttals and extensions as well. But I'll talk about that later. Okay, so firstly on brainstorm. All right, so basically when you first get a motion, there should be several things you ask yourself about the motion. So the first thing you should ask yourself is why was this motion set? Because usually motions are set because there exists a problem or there exists some sort of unsolved debate in real life where the motion then comes in play. So motions don't exist for things that are just uncontroversially true, are people accept as uncontroversially correct, are for problems that are already solved, right? Motions only exist if there's a problem that's not solved and the motion is supposed to be about who best solves that problem. So when you look at a motion, you should sort of try and ask yourself, is there a certain problem that inspired this motion? What is the problem that this motion is trying to solve? Another way that you can approach a motion when you first receive it is to look at the keywords in the motion. So you can try and define the keywords in detail. And when I say define the keywords, I don't just mean like, you read up the Oxford Dictionary and you just pluck out the definition from the Oxford Dictionary. I mean to sort of like define and characterize that word in the context of the motion and what it means for the motion. And I'll sort of explain this a bit more later. And so when we look at the keywords, sometimes keywords will refer to elements in the motion. Sometimes the elements in the motion will be a bit more implicit. Again, I'll explain this a bit more later. But you should also try and identify the key elements of the motion. So, for example, in most motions, there will be certain objects or institutions that are probably more important. That are probably more relevant to the motion. So you try and figure out what these institutions or objects are. Figure out why people care about these things. How people are how these institutions are affected by emotion on either side, and why does it matter when these institutions are affected by the way a certain motion pans out. The second thing that you want to identify in emotion is who are the relevant actors in emotion. So who are the people that are most impacted by emotion? And again, you want to ask yourself the same kind of questions, right? So why do we care about these people? How are they affected? Why does it matter if they're affected? But also importantly, for people particularly, you want to ask yourself like, what do these people or what do this group of people want and why do they deserve what they want? And so a lot of this is a bit abstract. I'll try and illustrate this with some examples. And again, just to be clear, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. Thank you. So like I think an easy example that should be accessible to most people would be like this house will ban school uniforms. So let's go back to the previous slides and try and figure out how we try to brainstorm this. And so I think most people could probably figure out the arguments in this house of ban school uniforms without having to employ any brainstorming techniques. But I think it's just good to illustrate how you would use these techniques on something simple like this. So for this house of ban school uniforms, you might, for example, go back and ask yourself, what are the relevant institutions in this motion, right? And so the most relevant institution in this house of ban school uniform is probably the institution of education or the institution of schools in general, right? So you need to ask yourself like, why do we care about schools? How are schools affected and why does it matter? Right. And so you can think about ideas of, for example, schools are important because they form the formative years, are the earliest years of a child's upbringing, and so they have a huge impact on a child. But schools are also especially important because they're sort of the only common experience that a lot of children go through, right? Because children's lives may be like hugely determined by whatever background they come from, what their family or parents decide for them. And the one place where the government, or the state, or the country as a whole gets to put all children in one place and do the same thing to all children is in the school. So in that sense, schools act as a social leveler throughout society, and that's also probably another reason why schools as an institution and education as an institution is particularly important, right? So you can think of some of these things. And again, the relevant actors in this motion, the most relevant actor is probably like the children are the students of that particular school who will be wearing school uniforms or who will not be wearing school uniforms, right? And so you will ask yourself like, why do we care about students? And again, I think you will get probably a lot of the similar answers that you would get when you ask yourself why education is important. You probably care about students for I think a lot of the cut and dry reasons that you can often give as to why students are important, right? Like students are vulnerable, they're young, they tend to be impressionable, they tend to be malleable. They're still like unshaped by the world, and so whatever you do to them at this particular point in time, has the propensity to really shape them to what they become to be in the future. And so that's why they're particularly important. And what they probably deserve is probably a good education, but they also probably deserve, for example, an education that develops their character as well, right? That teaches them not just how to study well and do well on exams, but also just equips them with the life skills, equips them with the sort of temperament needed to succeed in the future. Um, and so, if you ask yourself some of these questions, you will start to access certain arguments that will be relevant to the motion. So, for example, if you think about like schooling and how they are so largely impressionable, how schools are an important avenue, how students spend most of the time in schools, and that's why schools are an important institution. You may start to think about, for example, the very standard argument on GAF, which is the argument about self-expression. And so what you want, and so the argument that you could come up with by thinking about students and thinking about why students are important and why students matter, would be, for example, to say that like, students at this particular point in their life, they have very few avenues, are very few alternatives for expressing themselves and expressing who they are and expressing who they want to be, right? Because so much of their life is dictated by the parents, so much of their life is dictated by the school system around them and their environment in general. They get very little opportunity to make choices for themselves. And that's why it's important that at the very least, we let them make choices in terms of how they want to dress themselves now, in terms of how they want to present themselves, because it's the only avenue in which they're able to make choices. And then you have to, of course, mechanize why being able to wear whatever you want is an important form of self-expression. But the thing I want to try to communicate here is that like you would be better able, you will be able to sort of access this argument when you start thinking about why students are important, what students might need, and you start thinking, students are important because you form a large impression on them in schools. They spend a lot of time in schools, and so schools are an important environment in which their lives will be shaped. And what do they want? What do they deserve? It's probably being able to access things like greater agency, greater being able to express themselves and learn how to express themselves better. That's probably good for their mental health. That's probably good for their character development. And so this is just an illustration of how you would be able to generate arguments based on asking yourself questions about action. And so, okay, let me try and do this interactive thing. I hope it works. Um, yeah. So I think on your slider right now, there should be a poll. Ah, yes. And you can tell me like what are some other ideas you would brainstorm about these motions. And so you can pick either motion. You can pick the one I just did, or you can pick the other motion I provided here. And you can maybe just briefly type in what are some ideas you would brainstorm about for this motion based on the pointers I've just given? Yeah. So let's take maybe like 2 minutes to do this. I will tap back so you guys can see the other stuff. Yep, and so I've only received one answer, but it's fine. Um, to explain why it is important for students to make decisions, at least towards something in their lives. Yeah, sure. So, you would have to go and like ask yourself, how are they affected and why does it matter? And that's how you end up asking yourself the question of like, why does expression matter? Why does choice and agency matter for the students? Why does them being able to exercise that choice at this crucial stage in life? Why does that matter for students? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So that's brainstorming. Um, I'm not going to talk about argument construction. And so basically, once you have the rough idea of the argument in your mind, how would you want to construct it? How would you want to organize it into a coherent and complete argument? And essentially, I when building an argument, you need to always remember what is the problem in this debate you're trying to solve. So if in the previous example, the problem in this debate is that children don't get enough avenues for self-expression or avenues for choice. You always like keep this in mind while you're constructing an argument to make sure that every part of the argument you construct is relevant to this problem you're trying to solve and you don't get like accidentally sidetracked. So arguments there are many ways to organize arguments. Many of the formats for organizing arguments are, frankly speaking, kind of similar. I don't think there's one correct way of organizing it. I think you should probably find what suits you best, find what just makes the most sense for your own brain. But that being said, this is how I think of it, and this is what it works for me, especially when I was a school debater, I suppose. So for me, I think arguments can be roughly divided into three parts. There's characterization, which is setup. There's mechanism, and there's impact. And so the thing I want to hammer in here is that your mechanism and your impact are both equally important and necessary. So if you have only a mechanism, but you don't explain to me what the impact is and why the impact is important, then the argument is not complete, and I can't really buy it because I understand how something happens, but I don't understand why the thing happening matters at all. Um, Conversely, if you have only an impact but no mechanism, it's also quite bad, and I also can't buy an argument because I might buy that if the thing happens it's impactful and it has a good impact, but I don't buy that thing happens at all because I don't get a mechanism. So always remember you must have both a mechanism and an impact in your argument. So let's first talk about characterization. So characterization, what some people refer to as setup, sets up the problem, sets up other important things in the debate. So it's basically sort of like some people like to say it's like painting a picture. So you need to paint the picture, like what does the problem look like? Why is the problem not already solved? Like what's stopping the problem from being solved? If there are certain relevant actors in the debate, there are certain relevant objects and institutions in debate, how do these actors think or feel or act? What do they want? What do they look like? Why do they matter? So many of the same questions that we talked about in brainstorming, a lot of this can also be used to construct characterization and paint a picture of the debate for your judge. But the key thing I want to hammer in here is that characterization must always be for a purpose. So you don't characterize the debate or characterize random things in the debate for the sake of it. Right? Every characterization you deliver, every piece of setup you deliver, always has to be for a purpose. So what does this mean? Characterization is called setup because it sets up the debate for the rest of the argument. It constructs the debate and it constructs the world in a way that makes your arguments better. Right? So if you're able to characterize, for example, if you're able to characterize that certain actors think or feel in a certain way, it might make your mechanism more likely and believable. Because based on your characterization of how these people act, I'm likely to believe that a mechanism happens. Conversely, if you characterize that institutions are important, a particular institution is important because it fulfills a specific function in society that no institution does, that can also, for example, make your impact more important because it shows why it's so unique and it shows why it's so exclusive. So whenever you're thinking of characterization, always make sure that your characterization is doing something for your arguments, right? Your characterization has to be either helping the mechanism or helping the impact of your arguments or some other part of your argument. It could be help. Characterization could also be to box out your opponent's arguments, but that's a whole other thing. So, with characterization, some people have asked me like, do you have to put this at the start of your argument? Do you have to like where do you put your characterization? Frankly speaking, I don't really think there's a set rule for this. I personally prefer to integrate my characterization into the argument itself. And so basically, if a characterization is relevant to a specific mechanism, I'll just deliver it as part of the mechanism because I think it just makes it a lot clearer. It makes it a lot clearer to the judge what my characterization is trying to do. But some people do their characterization to start the argument. That's generally fine as well, I think. The next part, so once you've set up the world and what the world looks like, the next part of your argument should be the mechanism. So you need a bit of it's just a step-by-step process of how to get to your outcome, right? So the key thing to know here is that like you have to really break down your mechanism as granularly into into small of a piece, as small pieces as small as they can go, right? So um, initially you may come up with your mechanism as just like you going from point A to point E, but you have to figure out like all the intermediate steps between A and E, right? You need to figure out all the small little steps you have to make, and you have to ensure that you prove that every small little step you make actually happens, and your mechanism actually works all the way. One specific thing that I think debaters that I feel a lot of people need to pay attention more is to ensure that is improving that every actor involved in your mechanism actually acts and behaves in the way that you suggest that they will act. And so I'm just going to do a very quick tangent here into actor analysis. And essentially, if you want to suggest that an actor will do something, if your mechanism relies on actors, like groups of people, specific people doing something, there's two things you need to prove for this actor. The first thing is incentive, right? So you need to prove that the actor wants this to happen, or the actor desires this thing. But the second thing you need to prove is capacity. So does the actor actually have the ability to get this thing that they want? And the crucial thing to note here again is that if you for you to actually prove that an actor will do something that's part of a mechanism, you have to prove both incentive and capacity. You can't prove only one. So let me give a very easy example. Right, let's say I'm the actor, right? So my incentive right now might be that um I'm hungry. I'm not hungry, but let's pretend I'm hungry, right? So my incentive could be that I want to go down and buy chicken rice, but I don't have the capacity to do it because I'm in a lecture right now, and so I'm busy. And so in this case, I have incentive but no capacity, and so I can't actually do this behavior. Conversely, let's say later on, I'm free after this lecture, but I'm not hungry anymore. In that case, I have capacity, so I have the ability to go and buy the chicken rice, but I have no incentive because I'm not hungry anymore. So again, I will not actually do this behavior of buying chicken rice. So this just to illustrate that like if you prove only incentive or only capacity, that doesn't fly. You have to prove both incentive and capacity to prove that specific people or groups of people will act in the way you suggested they were. Okay, so that's mechanisms. Impacts. So impacts are essentially what is if your mechanism holds true and your mechanism reaches its endpoint. So like if you go all the way from A to B and you reach the endpoint of a mechanism, what is the outcome of your argument and why does it matter? Right? What is the thing that changes in the world and why is this change important? And one thing I think debaters need to consider more when trying to impact their arguments is tipping point. Right. So essentially the idea of tipping point, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that like in the real world, whether or not something happens depends on a lot of different influences, right? So whether or not something happens, there could be 99 reasons why something might happen, but also 99 reasons why something might not happen, right? Because most things in the real world are quite complicated and it's unclear whether, and just one single change will make a thing happen slash not happen. So essentially, if you can imagine, there's a scale, right? There's maybe reasons why the outcome won't happen. There's reasons why the outcome will happen. Tipping point analysis is basically trying to explain why your one argument, or why the mechanism of your argument is going to be what tips the scales over and makes the thing happen when there are 99 other things that are also influencing whether another thing happens. I'll try and illustrate this a bit more later. I understand this is like a little bit abstract. Yeah. So another thing to do with impact as well is that you don't just have to explain what the outcome is and why it matters. You have to explain why the outcome matters more than other outcomes in the debate. And this is sort of preemptive because like later on in debate, like before your speech in debate, there will probably be other arguments that also have their own outcomes and their own impacts. So weighing here is to try and convince your judge why the outcome of this particular argument you're running matters more than the outcomes of other debates. Matters more than the outcome of other arguments that exist in the debate. And so one way that there's several ways to do this. One way is scale. So scale refers to how many actors does your argument impact. So if your argument impacts a lot of people, you can argue that your argument is more important and should be weighed more heavily because it has greater scale. Conversely, depth refers to how deeply each actor is impacted. And so you might argue that, for example, your opponent's argument has scale, and so it impacts a lot of people, but your argument has more depth. So the people that it impacts are actually impacted more deeply, and their lives are profoundly changed by your argument. And so you should weigh your argument more heavily. So skill and depth are, I think, two of the ways that you can weigh your arguments and weigh the impacts that you attach to your arguments. Some other ways of doing this are vulnerability. And so you can claim that, for example, if your argument impacts the most vulnerable or important actors in the debate, then you should prioritize this argument because we should protect the most vulnerable people in the debate. There's certainty. So you might argue that your opponent's arguments are speculative. There's like a 50-50 chance of whether or not to happen, but your arguments are more certain. Like you're more sure that your arguments will happen, your mechanism will actually be true. Or lastly, exclusivity. So exclusivity is basically explaining that your argument is the most important because it is an impact that you will not get in any other way. So it's the impact that is most exclusive to your side. And so these are just some quick ways to weigh arguments. I understand that a lot of people don't typically weigh arguments when they deliver a constructive argument. They leave the weighing up to like their second speaker or like subsequent speakers. I think that as much as possible, it's good to incorporate weighing into your argument as soon as possible because it places more pressure on your opponents to respond to that weighing. And typically, if it comes out earlier in the debate, judges also tend to credit it more because it's been given more airtime in the debate as well. Okay, so let's do some examples. Right. So for example, with the motion, this house believes that governments should distribute funding to charities based on their effectiveness. Okay, actually, let me take a different approach. Let me give like everyone maybe like 3 minutes. And y'all can try and come up with an argument for either of these motions using any of these structures that I just went through. Right. I think you should be able to do that on Slido now. Yeah. Also, for anyone who hasn't joined this thing, you can join it with this QR code. Come on, please try. Please give it a try. If you don't understand it, there's a Q&A. You can feel free to ask questions. The questions are anonymous. Don't be shy. Okay, I received a question. Sorry, but what is a substantive? Um, so a substantive is an argument. So basically, this whole thing I've been trying to illustrate here, it's a substantive argument, and so it's called a substantive argument, because it's in contrast to a rebuttal, which is also an argument, but a substantive argument is like new material. It's just basically an argument. Yes, I hope that clarifies. Okay. I hope people are understanding what I'm saying. If you're not understanding what I'm saying, there's a Q&A. It is open at all times. Please, 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 please just drop a question into the Q&A. I will answer it. Okay, let's just move on. Um, so for example, let's say I take the motion this house believes that government should distribute funding to charities based on their effectiveness. Ooh. Mm, ah, sorry, I got lost in my slides. So we want to, for example, characterize that charities provide a lot of valuable assistance to vulnerable groups that will otherwise be overlooked by society. But you might also want to characterize the government in this debate, right? So you might want to characterize that governments have a finite amount of money to spend, and that the burden of duty of the government is to spend that money in a way that like benefits as many people as possible. And so that might be the characterization you might want to deliver for an argument for Gov on this house believes the government should distribute fundings to charities based on their effectiveness. Your mechanism might then be that if you can, there's that like maybe the first step might be that like you assess charities for their effectiveness based on metrics such as like for every dollar they spend, how much actually gets received by the beneficiaries, how much, for example, economic value is, for example, generated for every dollar that is spent by the charity, how many people are helped by the charity for every dollar spent and stuff like that. And how many people does the charity actually manage to help in a certain year? So you could outline that there are certain metrics that you would measure, that the government would measure to determine the effectiveness of the charity, and they would use these metrics to then allocate funding to the most effective charities. Um, what then you might say is that like when you allocate funding to these most effective charities, they obviously get more funding and they get more money, they get more resources to use. But I also want to add here that like the reason why these resources um, might be used appropriately and might be used most effectively is because like many of these charities will probably be larger charities, will be more established charities, will be charities with better connections. And so they can leverage on things like scales of economy, they can leverage on things like having more experienced leaders, more experienced networks, better connections with the community. And all of this means that they can, when they have more money, they're also able to spend that money in a more effective and efficient way. And then you might want to explain that like this just means that like more people get the help they receive and more people receive that assistance. More people receive more assistance, right? Because for example, you want to illustrate that like for example, if you're funding a soup kitchen charity, for example, this means that more people get fed, and this also means that more people get fed more times in a week. So maybe previously the charity was only able to provide meals for 2 or 3 days of a week, but now with more resources, they're able to provide meals for 4 or 5 days a week. They're able to provide meals for maybe double twice as many people as they previously provided meals for. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here is that like mechanism is a very step-by-step thing. You have to explain every step of the process, right? You have to explain how would you assess charities for effectiveness, how would you distribute the money to charities, why the charities will use the money effectively, how exactly this money will actually be used and what is the end outcome. So that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. It's just the step-by-step process of how you actually get to your outcome. You might then want to explain the impact of this. And so the impact is already sort of explained earlier on, right? Which is that just more people get help and more people get helped more at the time. And you might argue that like this, you might argue that this impact should be weighed highly in this debate because of scale. because your opponents on op are probably going to run something about how you can help smaller charities that help like more niche groups of people that will be overlooked by society. But what you would say in Gov is that your argument outweighs that because you're able to just help more people. Like you just simply help a lot more people, even if you don't help the specific groups of people that op wants to help. And so you weigh on a scale of impact. You might also want to weigh on certainty, for example, because you could argue that like ops arguments might be a bit uncertain or speculative because you don't know to what extent the charities will actually help the people they claim to help because they're not the most effective charities or charities with the best metrics. But on your side, you have more certainty because you know for sure that these are charities that are most effective, they have the most proven track record, and so you have more certainty. And so there are just certain ways that you can weigh your impact against other arguments that may exist or may soon exist in the debate. Yeah. So that's just some illustration for how you would want to construct an argument using all three parts of characterization, mechanism, and impacting. I'm going to take a short break at this point. So there's other considerations as well. Um, some other things I want to just briefly talk about when it comes to argument constructing is tiering. So where possible, try to have more than one mechanism. So if you have one impact, but you have maybe two or three mechanisms that can prove the impact will happen, this is a better way generally to construct an argument because it means that even if the opponent manages to refute one mechanism, you still have like one or two other mechanisms standing. But that being said, don't like dish out 10 mechanisms just for fun. Make sure that every mechanism you give out actually makes sense. It's actually convincing. Um, Another consideration to talk about is titling your arguments. Because I feel like one thing that novice debaters tend to struggle with is just they jump from argument to argument, and it's like the title of each argument is not very clear. It's not very clear where each argument starts and ends. So I think that when you deliver a new argument, always be clear that you're delivering a new argument and try to give your argument a title that neatly summarizes what the argument is about. And so one possible way of typing an argument can just be like it can be titled as mechanism and an outcome. So what is your mechanism and what's the outcome it causes? And so for example, in the previous argument, um, I guess you could title it as um, allocating allocating more funding to the most efficient charities ensures that the most number of people receive assistance from these charities, something like that. Right. So essentially, if it tries to summarize your mechanism and outcome into just one line, and that can be the title of your argument. Um, some other things I want to talk about is examples. I find that a lot of the time, instead of actually providing mechanisms, debaters just provide examples, but they don't explain the logic underlying the example. So examples are good. Examples keep your analysis grounded in reality and it helps the judge better see and visualize what you're trying to say. But examples cannot replace analysis. So aside from giving examples, you also have to give logical analysis. And one last thing, just preemption. So if there are any obvious rebuttals to your argument that you can think of, try and rebut them in advance. I try and like bake in the responses into your arguments in advance. Okay, so that's argument construction. Now I'm just going to be talking about strategy. And strategy is just basically how do you choose the best arguments to run? Because ideally in prep, you probably have enough time to think of like a couple of arguments. You probably think of like not just one or two, but maybe three or four arguments. And so you figure out what the best arguments to run. And this is probably particularly important in the BP format because you want to pick the arguments that are most relevant to the debate. Are the arguments that will probably stand the test of time in the debate because you have to make sure that the arguments are the most important arguments. Because if you take the less important arguments, then you give your closing half the ability to run with the more important arguments. And so strategy is particularly important in debate. And so some ways of I sort of like think of strategy in two steps. And so when deciding what arguments to run, what arguments to prioritize, I think there's sort of like two vibe checks you should perform. So the first vibe check, and this is something my coach told me a long time ago, is to sort of just look into your heart and be honest with yourself about the argument, right? If you were a spectator or a judge, will you find this argument genuinely confusing, like genuinely convincing? Sorry, like if somebody else delivered the argument to you, would it make you listen carefully? Or would it make you like confused and annoyed because like this argument seems ridiculous, seems out of the world? It's clearly out of touch of reality. It's clearly an argument from someone who hasn't touched grass, stuff like that. So if that's the case, then don't run the argument, right? So make sure that every argument you run is an argument you genuinely believe in, you genuinely believe is possible, and not just an argument that you are going to run because you came out of it and nothing else to run. So make sure that you actually believe the arguments you're running, is what I'm trying to say here. The second vibe check is to find the arguments that are both the most provable, and so the arguments with the most robust mechanisms, and the arguments that are most important, so the arguments with the most important impacts, right? So some questions you can ask yourself to figure out which arguments are the most provable or have the most robust mechanisms are like, does this argument have logical links you can actually prove convincingly? Because sometimes when you try and break down your argument into the different logical links, you realize they're like maybe one or two parts that are a bit like speculative. You can't really prove it will happen. It's kind of 50-50. In that case, the mechanism is probably not very provable. Conversely, is the mechanism you're trying to claim like too high and too lofty to be realistically achieved? Like, is it claiming an impact that is just a bit ridiculous and out of the world? Like for example, in a debate about like having more STEM education, might you claim that like having more STEM education is going to cure cancer and cure climate change, and it's going to be a silver bullet for things like cancer and climate change? If that's the case, then like the impacts you're claiming are probably too high, and there's probably no way to realistically prove a mechanism that reaches such a high impact. And again, you can also ask yourself, does the mechanism apply to most cases? Are the majority of cases are only a small minority of cases? And if it's the second, then again, it's probably not a very good mechanism. So these are just some quick pointers to figure out which arguments might have the most provable mechanisms, and therefore which arguments might be more strategically sound to run. The second thing you should consider when figuring out which arguments to run is, I think, impact. So which are the arguments with the most important impact? So again, some pointers you can ask yourself when figuring out which arguments to strategize and prioritize around are like, does your argument address the root cause of the problem? Is your argument broad enough so it affects a significant number of actors rather than a small minority of actors? And is your argument deep enough? So does it actually affect these people to a significant extent, or is its effect on people very surface level only? Some other things you also ask yourself will be like, does this argument work in the long term? Or is it just a short-term harm that you incur during a transition period? And so I think a lot of debaters tend to run arguments with harms that are only in the short term, but that usually disappear in the long term. So, for example, in the motion like this house will ban school uniforms, I think some op teams might run that like, people will get confused by the dress code. Teachers find the dress code confusing. It'll be hard to enforce. Students will be confused over what is and isn't allowed. But if you think about this argument a bit further, you realize it's just a mostly short-term problem, right? Because maybe in the short term when they're still figuring it out, maybe in the short term when they're still transitioning to a world without uniforms, you might have these problems and these confusions. But in the long term, they're almost certain to just iron themselves out, and these impacts probably don't last into the long term. And so if that's the case, that's probably also an argument that it should deprioritize because it has a short-term impact that will probably not be as important in the debate. Yeah. So that's all I had to say for strategy. I have a few last things to say. But before that, I would like to pause here for maybe like 2 minutes in case